And you guys, we are now going to be focusing on some new types of quadrilaterals that this time, these are not going to be parallelograms. So they're not going to have two sides or two pairs of sides that are parallel. Okay, so these will have some different properties. And we're going to be talking about properties of kites and trapezoids. So these are not parallelograms, unfortunately. They're not a special cool kind of parallelogram, but they're still unique and they're still a nifty type of quadrilateral. So get excited. So the first one we're going to talk about are kites. Okay, which I know you've seen kites. Kites are in the shape of what you think a kite is. So when you guys are like at the beach or in your backyard or you're at school and you and your buddy pull out a kite and fly in the air, guess what? It's named after its shape, which is a kite. Okay, so a kite, it's a quadrilateral with two pairs of congruent adjacent sides, with adjacent means next to, so it has two sides that are next to each other that are congruent. And opposite sides are not congruent. So in parallelograms, opposite sides were congruent, but this is not a parallelogram, so it's not going to have the same properties. Alright, so in a kite, the two sides that are right next to each other are congruent. So these two are congruent in these two, but the sides across from each other are not congruent, so be careful. Alright, so let's talk about some properties of kites. They have a lot of properties, so brace yourself. So number one, the diagonals are perpendicular. So when these two diagonals intersect each other right here, they form a right angle. So they form actually four right angles, and the angles will make 90 degrees because that's what a right angle is. So anytime you see a kite, the diagonals will form four right angles because they're perpendicular. So on your kite, usually it's like a wooden or kind of plastic or metal material to hold the kite together. Those two are actually perpendicular. So next time you're at the beach and you're flying a kite, you'll know those two pieces that are holding the kite together are perpendicular, which is cool. Okay, the second property, it has one set of congruent opposite angles. So it only has one pair of opposite angles that are congruent. And these are the angles created by the two non-congruent sides. So non-congruent sides make congruent angles. So you kind of think the opposite. The congruent angles have the non-congruent sides. So like this angle is formed by the two sides that are not congruent, but it's congruent. And this other angle that's congruent is formed by the other two sides that are not congruent. Okay, so the two non-congruent sides make congruent angles. So think the opposite on that one. Alright, the third property, the diagonals bisect the angles created by the congruent sides. So the two sides that are congruent, the angles that form those sides, when the diagonal hits them, it cuts it in half and makes two congruent angles. So these two are congruent and these two are congruent. So usually the way I remember, the two angles that are congruent are not bisected. So these two congruent angles, you cannot assume that this angle and this angle are congruent. So this diagonal is not necessarily bisecting the congruent angle. But the two angles that are not congruent are bisected. So the diagonal bisects and cuts that angle into two congruent angles. So I know it's kind of confusing, but you simply just kind of have to memorize these. Alright, and property number 4 is one diagonal, just one, is bisected by the other. So only one diagonal is cut in half. And it's the diagonal that intersects the two congruent angles. So the diagonal that runs through the congruent angles is the one that gets cut in half and makes these two congruent segments. So there's a lot of kind of crazy properties with kites, and a lot you just kind of sit there and memorize. If it helps you, like the diagonal that is split into two congruent pieces is the one with the congruent angles. And the angle that's bisected are the angles that are not congruent altogether. The two pieces are congruent, but not the whole thing. Okay, so I don't know if that helps, but you might just have to sit here and kind of memorize them and look at your picture. Alright, and in just a moment, you're going to be watching example problems 1, 2, and 3 and using your kite properties to solve for these problems. So example 2 is just for honors, but everyone will get to enjoy example 1 and 2. Sorry, 1 and 3. So go ahead and pause the video and learn how to solve example problems 1, 2, and 3. Alright, so now we are shifting gears onto trapezoids. So trapezoids have a lot of properties, which the more properties makes them the more interesting or the more epic. So be aware. Trapezoids are epic. Alright, so let's talk about trapezoids and their parts. So the basic definition of a trapezoid is a quadrilateral with only one pair of parallel sides. So it's almost a parallelogram, but not quite. Okay, so in a trapezoid, we only have one pair of sides that are parallel. The other two are not guaranteed to be parallel, so be careful. Alright, and a trapezoid has several parts. So the base of the trapezoid, there are two bases, they are the parallel sides. So like this side and this side, the two parallel sides are called the bases. So it has two bases. Now the legs of the trapezoid, they are the non-parallel sides. So the two sides that are not parallel are called the legs. So the two red sides over here are the legs. Alright, and the base angles are the two side-by-side angles whose common side is the base. So like these two angles right here share the same base. So these two are base angles and these two are base angles because they both share the bottom base. So there's two pairs of base angles in a trapezoid. Holy hot dog. And now we're going to talk about a specific kind of trapezoid called an isosceles trapezoid. Get excited. So let's think about this. What is an isosceles triangle? You guys are too cool for school. An isosceles triangle is a triangle with two congruent sides. Well, guess what, you guys? An isosceles trapezoid is a trapezoid whose legs are congruent. So it has two congruent sides as well. Okay, so if we look at the trapezoid, I know it's a little blurry, but the two legs, the two non-parallel sides, are congruent. So this one and this one are congruent. And there are some special properties associated only when your trapezoid is isosceles, so be careful. When your trapezoid is an isosceles trapezoid, each pair of base angles will be congruent. So the two angles that share a common base are congruent. So like the blue angles are congruent and the red angles are congruent down here. So base angles are congruent, just like in an isosceles triangle, right? Alright, and also the entire diagonals are going to be congruent. So diagonal A to the C is congruent to diagonal D to the B. So you have two congruent sides, two parallel sides, two pairs of congruent base angles, and two congruent diagonals. So a lot of congruent stuff going on. Cool, right? So using these properties of an isosceles trapezoid, we will tackle example 4 and 5, as well as example 6 and 7. So go ahead and pause the video and tackle example 4, 5, 6, and 7 with me. Alright, and our final trapezoid theorem is called the mid-segment theorem. Now, what do you think is located mid-segment or in the middle of a segment? What is that point called, located like in the middle of something? It is a midpoint. So something happens when you connect the two midpoints of the legs of a trapezoid. So we have this thing called a midsegment, which a midsegment of a trapezoid is a segment whose endpoints are the midpoints of the legs. So if you find the midpoint of each leg, which this is a midpoint because it cuts it in half and makes two congruent segments, as well as M, so M and N are midpoints. This M is the midpoint of side AB, and it makes these two congruent segments. And the midsegment connects these two midpoints. So this is called a midsegment. Its endpoints are midpoints, midsegment, midpoints, okay? And there's some special properties that go along with this midsegment. So the trapezoid midsegment theorem states the midsegment of a trapezoid is parallel to each base. So this segment is parallel to this base, and the midsegment is also parallel to the bottom base. Alright, and also its length is half of the sum of the lengths of the bases. So what does sum mean? Okay, sum means to add something together. So the sum of the lengths of the bases. So if you add the two bases together and take half of it, you will get the length of the midsegment. So first of all, let's talk about the sides that are parallel. So your midsegment MN is parallel to AD as well as BC. So the midsegment is parallel to each base. And the midsegment length is 1/2 the sum of the lengths of the two bases. So if you add AD to BC, so if you add the bases together and take half of it or divide by 2, same thing, bam, you get the length of the midsegment. So using these nifty properties, you guys will conquer example 8 and 9. So go ahead and pause the video and watch example videos 8 and 9. And guess what, you guys? That's it with trapezoids. I know it's sad, but that's all we're going to talk about today with trapezoids and kites. So I hope you guys learned a lot about trapezoids and kites.